All right, this lesson is going to be all about some of the basics of chemistry. One of the things that you need to know for biology class is a little bit about chemistry. Hopefully this won't be too difficult for you to understand. I'm going to try and make it as simple as I can. So in order to understand biology, of course, you have to know a little bit of chemistry, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I don't really even know how much you might already know about chemistry, so we're going to start with some basics. First of all, every living thing that we're going to learn about and study about all year long is made of these little things called atoms. A-T-O-M-S. Atoms. Atoms are what make up every single solid object or liquid object or anything that we come into contact with. The air, everything is made of these things called atoms. And atoms are made of smaller parts that are called electrons, protons, and neutrons. And they're arranged in such a way, like in this diagram here, you see protons and neutrons in the center part of the atom, and then way outside somewhere are these little electrons. The electrons are much smaller, and protons and neutrons are larger. Now, these particles are also charged, so that electrons are carrying a negative charge. Protons are carrying a positive charge. And neutrons have no charge. So this is a similar diagram to the one you saw before, but now you can see that in the center of the atom here, you have some positive charge, and then outside, around the outside where the electrons are, zooming around, you have some negative charge. Now, the other thing you need to know is that the atoms of every different kind of matter, we call them elements. Each one of those atoms is slightly different. So we can talk about oxygen atoms are different from nitrogen atoms, and those are different from hydrogen atoms, and they're different from carbon atoms. Oxygen, carbon, they're all different when you look at the tiny little particles, the atoms that make them up. Now, for reasons we cannot go into in biology class, but if you take chemistry, you'll learn more about it. For some reasons, atoms are not happy, or the word is stable, with the electrons that they have. So for some atoms, they would prefer to lose an electron or gain an electron. So these electrons are on the outside, as I said before, way out here, zooming around. And for some atoms, they would like to get rid of one and lose it. And for some of them, they would like to get another one. Okay, if they do that, we call them ions now. They're not atoms, they're ions. They're going to have a charge. Now, sometimes instead of losing or gaining electrons, in order to be stable, atoms will share electrons. So instead of getting rid of one or getting a new one, instead they'll share. So there might be an atom that would like to get one, and there might be an atom that would like to get rid of one, and then they just end up sharing. And this is when they do this, they get stuck together and they form something called a chemical bond. And then we no longer have an atom, it's now called a molecule. A molecule. It forms a molecule, and molecules make up these things we call compounds. Compounds. An example of a compound is sugar. Another example is baking soda. Now, when atoms do this and they share electrons and they form these bonds, if they're sharing, it's called a covalent bond. Okay, an example of this is two carbons bonded together, like in here. You see one carbon and you see another carbon, and they're bonded together with a covalent bond. Another way of thinking about it, this diagram's a little bit hard to see, but you have two carbon atoms. There's one and there's one. And then all these little dots are where the electrons would be, and you see that they're still going on the outside of both of those atoms, but they're spending a lot of time in between, and that's what's holding the atoms together. And that's called a covalent bond. Now, if you understood that part about the covalent bonding, now we're going to get a little bit trickier. Now we're going to talk about how sometimes when a covalent bond is formed, when electrons are sharing, each atom doesn't share evenly. In other words, some atoms take the electrons more than other atoms. They pull on them more, and so the electrons stay with some atoms more of the time than with other atoms. And this is only some kind of molecules that do this, some kind of atoms that do this. For instance, this is an example where we have oxygen and we have hydrogen. Oxygen will pull the electrons more than hydrogen will. That's just how oxygen is, and that's how hydrogen is. So they're sharing these two electrons here, but oxygen really is pulling those electrons more than hydrogen. And you can kind of see that represented by this gray area that's around the oxygen atom. There's less gray area around the hydrogen. Now, when that happens, oxygen has sort of more of the electrons more of the time, and electrons have a negative charge to them. So what that means is that the oxygen on that side of the molecule, it will be slightly negative. That's represented here by this symbol. It's a slight negative charge. And then the hydrogen, because it's pulling less on the electrons, it's got less negative, so it's a little bit positive. It's a slightly positive charge over there, and we represent that here by this little symbol. It's a slight positive charge. Now, the reason why I'm going into this detail is because this is really important for the next thing we're going to talk about, that you understand this. Because of this slight positive and slight negative charge, some molecules have something called hydrogen bonding. This is another kind of bonding. So we have covalent bonding, which sticks them together like glue. But we also have something called hydrogen bonding due to these slight positives and negatives. Of course, negatives and positives attract like a magnet. And in some molecules that have these slight negative and slight positive charges, it attracts the molecules so that they want to stick together. This is called a hydrogen bond. Very, very crucial in water. Now, is water important to life? Absolutely. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about water because it's life evolved in water and life cannot survive without water. We are watery kinds of living things on this planet. And so the properties of water are extremely important to understand as we study living things. And water shows hydrogen bonding because the oxygen has a slight negative charge and the hydrogen has a slight positive charge. So water molecules have this property that they like to stick together. The hydrogens are slightly positive and they're attracted to the slightly negative oxygens on the water molecules. So water molecules look something like this right here. And I call them Mickey Mouses. They kind of look like a Mickey Mouse shape. And the end that has the ears, the hydrogens, is slightly positive, and the end that's more of the Mickey Mouse face, the oxygen end, is slightly negative. Now, because of this, water has unique properties. Water is special, very special. Because of the hydrogen bonding, it shows certain properties. The first is that water, because of these properties of being sticky, it can absorb a lot of heat. That's why water can be used to cool things, like this elephant is cooling itself with water, and that's why sweating cools you off. That's why it's always cooler at the beach. That's why it's cooler around a lake than it would be away from the lake. Water has this property of being able to absorb a lot of heat, and it cools things off. Secondly, water expands when it freezes. This is a very important property that water has for living things. So for instance, here's warm water and here's cold water, and you can see the little Mickey Mouse shapes. These are our water molecules. They're free to move around in warm water and even in cold water. But when water freezes, because of these these attractions between the molecules, it forms this regular pattern to its structure. You see this, how it has this pattern, and the molecules actually are spread out in frozen water, in ice. They spread out more, and because they spread out, they expand. Because they expand, they float. And because water floats, life can survive way down in the cold water. It never freezes down here. The ice provides an insulating layer, and if it weren't for that, most lakes in the winter in the cold, cold areas would freeze over, and life could not survive. But as it is, when the ice forms on the surface, down below, the fish and all the organisms can still survive even in the frozen winter. And this is very important, of course, to the organisms that live there. The third way that water is special is because of hydrogen bonding, of course. Water has something that we call surface tension. And that is that it acts like it has a skin on it. And we're actually going to do some activities with this in class in a couple of days. But you need to know that water, that's why water forms droplets like these. That's why leaves can float on the surface, and even some bugs can float on the surface of water. Water acts like it actually has some kind of a skin, and it'll form droplets because of that. And this is because the actual molecules of water are being attracted to each other, and they end up acting like they have a skin on them. Surface tension. Water is also special because it ends up being able to travel up trees due to this hydrogen bonding. Okay? You ever wonder how water can get all the way from the roots down here all the way up the tree? You ever wonder about that? It's due to this thing that we call capillary action. What happens is water molecules that are way down here in the roots pull on water molecules that are in the soil, and they're pulled by water molecules that are in the trunk, and they're pulled by water molecules that are out here on the branches, and they're pulled by the leaves, and those water molecules in the leaves are evaporating into the atmosphere. And so you can think of it like a whole chain of water molecules all pulling on each other and pulling the water from the soil all the way up through the tree and then out into the atmosphere. And it's because the molecules stick together. This wouldn't be the case for other kinds of liquids. Water's special this way, and so because of that, of course, the tree can get water all the way from the roots all the way up to the leaves. Very important property for plants. Another example of this that you've probably seen is when you use paper towel to pick up some spill that you might have made. You dip just the end of the paper towel in, and doesn't it travel up the paper towel? You ever wonder why it does that? It's because of hydrogen bonding. The water molecules in the spill are pulling as the water begins to touch the paper towel, and each water molecule is pulling on the next one until they end up traveling up the paper towel. That's called capillary action, very important for living things. And finally, this is the last property of water I wanted to talk about. Because of the hydrogen bonding and the stickiness of water, it is very good at dissolving. It's a good solvent. The word for that is solvent. It's good at dissolving things. We put sugar in water, we put salt in water, and of course, everything in your cells is dissolved in water because you're made of mostly water. And so because of that, water is called a good solvent. In fact, it's called the universal solvent sometimes. Universal solvent, because it can dissolve just about anything. Very crucial. Think about ocean water. Everything's dissolved in ocean water, all the different minerals and salts in the ocean. Also, like I said, your blood, your cells inside. If it weren't for water being able to dissolve those things, we wouldn't have the organization in the cells and the blood that we have in our bodies. So these are the properties of water that are crucial for life, and it's all because of hydrogen bonding. All right, I hope you wrote some good notes down, and I will see you in class.